All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Product Training with Blue Triangle. Today, we're going to talk about how to use the Blue Triangle API. So, about a year ago, we did a product training session on this same topic, and that time it was really a comprehensive overview of everything the Blue Triangle API can do. But today, we're going to focus in on the more commonly used areas of our API, which is where you can pull your real user or synthetic data. So before we get into it, a couple of things I'll mention. If you joined us before, you know we'll post a recorded version of our session today in our Help Center. So if you'd like to share this or check it out a little later, you can do that at help.bluetriangle.com. Also, we'll save time at the end of the session today for questions. So feel free to ask questions using the tab to the right of your screen, and we'll be happy to go through those with you toward the end. My name is Mark, and I'm the support manager here at Blue Triangle, and joining me today is Emily Krieger. Emily is widely considered our resident API expert, and she was nice enough to put together this wonderful set of slides for us today. And while I will mainly be going through these, Emily will be on standby to help answer questions a little later on. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So for the agenda today, we're going to start off with just an introduction to our API. We'll talk about, at a high level, everything that it can do. So we'll give you an overview of our current endpoints. And then we'll go through the basics of how to connect to the API. What are the headers that you need to send along to make sure that you're going to get access? One of those is your API key, which each unique Blue Triangle user has their own, and we'll show you how to find that API key in your user profile. And then we're going to get into the performance endpoint. So I know in the summary for this product training, I mentioned that we'll be discussing the performance endpoint and the resource endpoint. But as I was preparing for this, I was looking at how much material I really wanted to go through with you guys, and I think the best way to go through it is let's just dedicate this whole session to the performance endpoint. And I know that a lot of the methodology and the parameters and a lot of the same functionality works the same between the performance and the resource endpoints. But I think what we're going to do is next week we'll save that time for going through just the resource endpoint, while today we just talk about the performance endpoint. And so when we get into it, we're gonna go through what is the minimum set of parameters required to send a valid API request, right? And then from there, we'll talk about expanding on that and filtering by additional options, like the traffic segment, or filtering by desktop only. And finally, we'll get into more of a complex example that really shows the power of the API and how you can kind of accomplish more than one thing in the same API request. So stay tuned for that. It will be pretty interesting. The idea behind this training, and the idea I really want to help everyone understand, is how people like us who are really familiar with the API, how we go about building a request to the API, essentially a request query, kind of from the ground up. So there's a methodology behind it that we want to share with you, and hopefully we're going to do that in the following slides. But first, let's just give you an overview of our current endpoints, and we'll get into connecting to the API and some other things at a high level. All right, so these are the 5 endpoints that we have right now at Blue Triangle. There is the performance, resource, error, site event markers, and CSP. So each of these is in our documentation and when you go to our documentation, you'll see that the URL to the API is api.bluetriangletech.com/performance/resource, etc. And that's what we mean by endpoints here. So just to run down the list here real quick, the performance endpoint gives you page level data. So this is on load, this is time to interactive at a page level. And this endpoint can also give you business data like revenue, orders. It gives you page views and things like that. And then the resource endpoint gives you what we call web content detail, WCD data, resource data. And this is performance for individual files and domains. So if you're familiar with the aggregate waterfall in Blue Triangle, this is where that data comes from. It comes from the resource endpoint. Along the same lines, the error endpoint is dedicated to JavaScript errors, and this includes content security policy violations, the error time and the error message, and you can get some high-level trends about what types of errors have been happening over a certain period of time and things like that. So those three at the top are really the data access API endpoints, and then the two at the bottom are more for configuration and other things. So the site event markers are these are actually annotations on graphs for marking significant site events, and you can create as many of these as you'd like, and you can customize them by line color, and this endpoint essentially allows you to manage those event markers. You can set up triggers on your system to depending on when an issue occurs, you can automatically have a site event marker created via this API, just as a basic example. And then finally, our content security policy endpoint. You can pull CSPs by version and a variety of other things. It's basically managing your content security policies, much like the site event markers. And we've done a few webinars about content security policies. If you're more interested in that, I would recommend checking some of those out. You can find those in the product training section in our Help Center. Today we're going to focus in on the performance endpoint. And the reason for that is really if you go into Blue Triangle, probably about 70% of the data that you see is probably coming out of the performance endpoint. There's really a massive amount of data that this endpoint can serve up to you. One of the questions that has come up pretty often recently here in support is, I'm looking at this graph or table in Blue Triangle. How could I pull this same data from the API? And almost every single time, it's going to either come from the performance or the resource endpoint. So first, how do you get to the API documentation? Well, it's in our Help Center and the documentation section. So if you're in Blue Triangle, you can get to the Help Center using the question mark icon. This is in the top right side of the screen. And when you get to the Help Center, you just hit documentation, and you'll be able to see an entire section for the API, and you'll see different articles for the different endpoints. All right. So how do you connect to the API? There's a variety of ways to do it, but for this training, we're going to be showing you examples in Postman. We found this is the easiest tool to use, but certainly you can connect to the API with any programming language, curl, Python, really anything that can request and receive HTTP messages. So in terms of what you need to connect to the API, there's 3 headers you're going to want to set. One is your XAPI email, the other is your XAPI key and content type. So in this example, we're connecting to api.bluetriangletech.com/performance, and we're doing a post, which is very important. We're doing a post, and the content type is going to be application JSON. All right. And some of our endpoints use GET, but for the resource and the performance endpoints, both of these use only the post. So how do you get your API key? It's really quite simple. If you click on your little profile icon, if you're logged into Blue Triangle, you can click to view profile, and then among the profile settings, there is a API key that's already set up for you in your profile, and you can just copy and paste that into whatever program, or if you're using Postman, you can copy that right into the XAPI key header. So let's show you an example, a basic example request. This is kind of a total overview of what it would look like in Postman. So in Postman, you're going to select your request method. This is a post to, like I mentioned before, api.bluetriangletech.com/performance. And you're going to set your headers in this tab, and then go over to the body. And to set up JSON, which is what we're going to use, you click on this raw little dial, and then go over here to the drop down and choose the JSON option, and then you'll be able to plug in a JSON a lot like this, and then you're just going to hit send. So obviously the question is, how did you put together this JSON? And that's what we're going to be getting into over the course of this training. And while I'm here, I'll just go ahead and mention this PowerPoint. I'll add a link to download this toward the end of the training, so that you can follow along with this later on. It's actually really quite helpful. There's links in here to documentation and some other things, so look out for that toward the end. All right, so now that we know how to connect to the API, we got our headers set, and we are doing a post to, we'll start with the performance endpoint. Now we want to figure out, how do we set up this JSON structure to get what we want. So let's dive into the performance endpoint. All requests to the performance endpoint are going to be an HTTP post to api.bluetriangletech.com/performance. And we're just going to talk right now about what are the minimum set of parameters that are required to create a valid request to the API. So the API documentation can be quite overwhelming, especially for some of the larger endpoints like the performance endpoint. And so what we're trying to do here is help you focus in on what are the essentials and what's the easiest way to construct your JSON request. So to the right here, these are the required parameters for each API request to the performance endpoint. There's, in the API documentation, there's a link to this section at the top of the page, and certainly if you're working on this on your own time, do use that link, and it'll shoot you down right to this section. All right, so the required parameters are the site. This is your site prefix. If you have a JavaScript tag, this is what is in front of. This is the host name for the btttag.com/btt.js. And if you're not quite sure about that, or if you don't have a JavaScript tag, we'll go into a little more detail on that a little later on. But then there is the start and end of the time period you're looking at. There's a group by parameter. Then there are data columns, which are going to be performance timings, page views, and other things like that, revenue, for example. And then finally, data type. So you're going to need to specify whether you want RUM, synthetic, or base page data. And base page data, by the way, is just a specific form of the synthetic data. It is for the base page and SSL synthetic monitors, and also for the API, the multi-step API synthetic monitor. So we're gonna go through each of these in depth, actually, in just a second. So let's go into that right now. So the site parameter tells the API which site to pull the data from. So, and this is unique to each site. Demo Sports is our demo e-commerce global site, and we use this obviously for demos. So, and depending on your account with us, your organization may have multiple brands, which means you may have multiple sites, or you may have a test site. And these prefixes, we call them prefixes because if you look down at this script source line, there's a demo sports is in front of the btttag.com/btt.js, like I mentioned. And these, so whatever this is for you, can be found on the sites page of the portal. And as I mentioned, if you have a JavaScript tag, it's going to be the host name here in this source include line. All right, so that is the site parameter. Next is the data type parameter. It's really quite straightforward. Do you want the real user data or the synthetic data? And the options are RUM and synthetic. And as I mentioned, there's the base page data type as well. And just to kind of give you maybe a more visual idea of this, in the real user monitoring and synthetic monitoring sections, you probably notice a lot of the pages are the same, or at least a few of them. Now, basically, RUM data would be coming to the performance detail, and the synthetic data would be coming to the synthetic monitoring performance detail. All right, now the start and end parameters, and here's the view of it over here. It's basically what is the time period you want to look at for your request to the API. So these are both specified in Epoch. One of the tools that we often use is epochconverter.com. It's actually super useful. And as you can see here, we're building the request as we go through these. So we got our site, demo sports, we got our data type, RUM, and then we have our start and end epochs. And this doesn't need to be in a string format. It can also be an integer. Either way should work fine. All right, so moving on to data columns. Okay, the data columns parameter usually includes the performance metrics, any numerical data. So if the piece of data you're looking for isn't in the filters menu, and instead it's actually on the graph or a table, then chances are it's going to be included in the data columns field. And this link here will take you to the data columns section and the documentation. And another thing is, if you're familiar with SQL, this would be the select clause. So what are the things that you're selecting in your query? Some of the common ones are page hits, onload, revenue, orders, time to DOM interactive, visitors, and etc. So some of these are pretty straightforward in terms of the spelling, but things like time to DOM interactive, those are a little unique. So certainly reference our API documentation to find the right name for what you need. All right, and then the group by parameter. So this is essentially the group by clause of an SQL query. some of the common ones here would be device or traffic segment, page group, page name, browser, OS, etc. These are things that are typically that would show up in the filters menu in the Blue Triangle portal. So at this point, we have all of the required parameters necessary to send a valid request to the API. And so now I'm going to show you what that looks like on the next slide here. So this is a valid request, and to the right we can actually see the actual response. So what we're doing is getting the page hits as the data column, and we're grouping that by the device, and we're looking at RUM data over that start and end epoch time period. And if you look at the response, you can see each device is listed here along with the number of page hits over that time period. So this is kind of like the basics, but what if you want to filter this data down even further? Okay, so that gets us into how to apply filter options. So let's say you're trying to reproduce a graph in the portal. Let's say in the revenue analysis page, there is the revenue over time graph. The thing is, you want to only pull it for desktop devices and certain traffic segments. So based on what we've already covered, we know what data columns that we would need to request. So it would be revenue, page views, and orders. We could do the grouping by time, and we could set the proper time period, right? And then how do we filter this by only the desktop devices and the certain traffic segments? Okay. So to start out, we're going to set the 6 required parameters that we just went through. We're going to go ahead and set those up, and we're going to plug in the revenue, orders, and page hits in the data columns array, and then the group by time. And the start and end here can be the epoch in seconds for whatever you like. And since this is revenue and orders we're talking about, this is going to be RUM data. So now that we have the minimum parameters, we can talk about the filtering. The filter options are typically key value pairs, where when there's more than one, it will be an array. So this would be similar in the portal to selecting the various filters in the filters menu. And so based on the documentation, what we're going to want to add is traffic segment, which is traffic seg here, and device. And all you need to do is just put in the exact string for each of these traffic segments, and then the device, you can see the options listed in the documentation. The options are desktop, mobile, and tablet, and we're going to choose that desktop option right here. Another thing that can be important for this sort of a query is to sort the request to make sure we're getting the result in chronological order, right? So let's say you made this request, but the hours are all out of order. So how do we do this chronologically? So in the documentation, there are order and sort parameters that you can use to tell the API how you want the response to be sorted. So by looking at that documentation, we can see we can order by the time, and we can sort by ascending, just like this. So hopefully that gives you an idea of kind of how we start from scratch. We get our required parameters and set those up how we want. We figure out what are the data columns that we need, and what are we grouping by? Are we grouping by time or device, or any of these other possible grouping options? And then from there we can think about what filter options do I want to apply to this data set in order to get the data that I need, and then with that result, how can I format that result in the easiest digestible way. So now let's talk about a more complex example. So we put together an example here, and here is the use case. So you have another system like, for example, Tableau, and you want to pull Blue Triangle's data into that. There's a lot of data you want to bring in, and you really don't want to create 12 different API calls, pulling these things one graph or table at a time. So to take an example from Blue Triangle, on the Real User Performance Overview page, there's a table at the bottom that shows all of our real user performance metrics broken out by country, region, browser, ISP, and traffic source. So in order to optimize our portal, all of this data is actually pulled in one query. And we're gonna walk through how to assemble this JSON to see exactly what's going on under the hood, and ultimately so you can do something like this for your own benefit. So as we think about how we're going to start to put this together, like I mentioned, you could do this one at a time using the group parameter. Alternatively, you can specify multiple group by parameters, and you can request all this data at once. So for these tables, there are actually 13 different metrics, plus grouping the data by country, region, browser, ISP, and traffic source. So as we go back to our trusty documentation, we can look up the name for each of these options. These are going to be obviously the data columns for the metrics and the group by options. And so this request is going to be a little longer, so we're going to show you this on the next slide. So here's what it's going to actually look like. We have our basic 6 parameters here, and what you see in blue is what we've added to get this data. All right, but in a second you'll notice we're not quite done yet, but let's just look at what we're doing here. So each of these data columns is one of the metrics in the graphs on the Real User Performance Overview page in Blue Triangle. So these are all of the metrics, and at the end here you have page hits, which obviously represents the page views. And so for the group by parameter, these are the various options that we know we're going to need to reproduce those graphs in the bottom of the Real User Performance Overview page. Let's send this off to the API and see what happens. All right. One of the things you're going to notice with that request is there's only a 100 data points in the result. Looking at the graphs in Blue Triangle, we know that there's got to be much, much more than 100 rows of data. So the question now becomes, what do we need to do to get all of the data? What is wrong here? So as we get into troubleshooting this, the reason we only received 100 rows of data is because of some default values in the API. And just much like the Blue Triangle portal, when you see defaults like exclude bots and the average type is arithmetic, in this case the API has a default limit of 100, and in order to override this, you can go ahead and add the limit parameter and specify 5,000 to the request. And if you look at the documentation, you can see that the max limit is 50,000. Another thing is, if you need to pull more than 50,000 rows at once, you can use we have a pagination method that you can use, where if you specify the page and the page number, you can iterate through the pages of data that you need if it's a very large request. All right, so let's go ahead and plug this in. This is the same request that we had before, and then we just added the limit. All right, so now we see that there are 50,000 items in the result. this is much better. So I think this is what we want. And you're able to also iterate through the pages of this data if it's really over 50,000. So, instead of 12 different API queries, you can put together this grouping by the right things and using the right data columns to get a really significant amount of data in just a couple of requests. Another thing is, depending on your account configuration, you'll notice there's requests allowed and requests made here. Requests allowed is the daily limit of API calls that you can make, and this is for your account. And requests made is how many have been made today. So depending on what that limit is, it might behoove you to try to optimize the number of queries you're running. All right. So just some closing thoughts now, and some of the key takeaways. So today we went through the performance endpoint, which is really the most used endpoint of the Blue Triangle API. When you're building a request to the API, you should always start with those required parameters and just a simple trimmed down version of what you think you're going to need, and just build up from there. And what you can do is validate the response each time along the way. This makes troubleshooting much easier. The other thing is, in order to validate you're pulling the right data from the API, one of the best things to do is actually load a graph in Blue Triangle and compare the output to what you're getting from the API. All right, and when you're troubleshooting a request or you're looking for an option that we haven't covered today, definitely go into the documentation page for that endpoint, whether it's the performance resource, whatever it may be. But if you do have any further questions, if you're stuck on a problem, always feel free to reach out to us. You can contact us through our help center at help.bluetriangle.com, or you can email us at support@bluetriangle.com, and we're always happy to help. All right, so I'm going to pause now and check to see if there's any questions we can help answer for you guys. I know we've come up on our 30-minute time here, but I'm going to see if we can answer at least a couple of questions. So let's get into a couple of questions. The first one I see here, and Emily, I think I'll direct this one over to you to let you join in here with us. So when trying to run a request to the API, I keep getting the error message, incorrect email or API key provided. Everything looks right to me. What's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. So typically when we see this, it means that there's some sort of mismatch between the email address listed in the user's profile and the one in the API request. Or another thing that you should definitely check is whether or not the exact case matches the user profile. So both email addresses and API keys are case sensitive.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, and I think just validating those two things should get around the issue. All right, I think we'll just do one more. I know we're a little over time, but so this one is, if I don't want to manually run each request through Postman, how can I do this in another language? Okay, so this is actually a really good question, and let me just pull up my Postman here. So in Postman, assuming you have everything set up correctly, you have your headers and the post to the right endpoint and your JSON. There's actually a little button over here called Code, and if you click on that, what you can do is export the request to any of about 25 different languages. I'm a Python guy, so I like to use the requests version here, but you can export to curl, you can export to JavaScript with jQuery or XHR, and really any of these. So I think this can really if you start from Postman, you can really get to any other language here. All right, with that, guys, we appreciate your time. And if you do have any more questions, we're happy to speak with you offline. So feel free to reach out to us anytime. And you can use any of the emails here, or you can also reach us in support anytime via the Help Center at help.bluetriangle.com. And so next week, we'll be going over the resource endpoint. I know today we ran out of time, but hopefully you were able to learn a lot. And next week, we'll expand on that with the resource endpoint, which is basically where you can find data on the performance for domains and files on your site. For more information about Blue Triangle product training, like how to watch past sessions or how to register for upcoming ones, be sure to check out our Help Center. Again, that's help.bluetriangle.com. And when you're there, just click the big button for product training. All right, guys, that's all we have for you today. Thanks again for your time, and we'll see you next time. Have a great day.